Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story.
The night settles over the silent empires, where danger lingers in every shadow and survival belongs to those who refuse to fall quietly. Tonight, we turn to Legs Diamond, the relentless outlaw whose sharp instincts, fearless resolve, and uncanny ability to escape death made him a legend of the Prohibition-era. His life wasn't shaped by caution, but by close calls, whispered threats, and a reputation built one narrow escape at a time. Before we begin, tap that like button. We're aiming for 100 likes tonight, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support keeps these whispered stories alive in the stillness of the night. Now lean back, breathe slow, and let the story of Legs Diamond guide you deeper into the quiet. New York just after midnight, and the city feels like it's holding its breath. A patrolman turns the corner and sees nothing, just a shuttered storefront, a darkened doorway, a delivery wagon that doesn't quite belong. Somewhere nearby, a steel door closes with the soft finality of money-changing hands. Inside, the music is low enough to deny, loud enough to promise. A man at the entrance doesn't wear a uniform, but he's there for the same reason the uniform is: control. He watches the street the way a bookie watches a clock. Up on the avenues, the respectable world sleeps behind lace curtains. Down by the docks and the tenements, it's a different schedule. A nation has outlawed the drink that oils its celebrations and dulls its grief. The law says drive, but the city, restless, crowded, hungry, answers with 1,000 quiet bargains. This is the tension of the era, the gap between what's written and what's real, wide enough for an empire to slip through. And in that gap, men are made. Before Jack Legs Diamond becomes a headline, before juries, judges, and reporters turn him into a kind of dark folk character, he is a boy shaped by the same forces shaping New York itself. Immigration and aspiration, poverty and performance, the lure of fast cash, the closeness of the waterfront, and the hard lesson that respect can be rented, but fear is often taken. His story begins in the churn of the late 1890s, in a family that, depending on which record you trust, starts in Philadelphia and reaches back across the Atlantic to Ireland. Many biographical references place Diamond's birth in Philadelphia in 1897 to Irish immigrant parents, while noting that details of his earliest years were later mudded by rumor, reinvention, and the fog that trails anyone who lives at the edge of the law. That uncertainty matters, because it's the first clue to how the Diamond legend works. The man and the myth will run side by side, sometimes close enough to touch, sometimes drifting apart. What's clearer is the environment that raised him. At the turn of the century, American cities are magnets. They pull in labor, languages, and the stubborn hope that the next street over holds a better life. They also concentrate everything harsher: overcrowded housing, unstable work, neighborhood politics, petty corruption, and the everyday arithmetic of survival. For Irish-American families in the urban Northeast, respectability is attainable, but often fragile, easily punctured by a sick day, a layoff, or a landlord who doesn't care what you can afford. This is not unique to Diamond. It is the shared backdrop of a generation, but it sets the stage for why certain skills, charm, quick talk, a tolerance for risk, become valuable long before anyone calls them criminal. Diamond grows up near the kind of places where boys learn the world by watching men. Street corners, stoops, pool rooms, dance halls, the edges of docks where cargo becomes opportunity. There's work, but it's irregular. There's authority, but it's selective. There's a moral code, but it's enforced by reputation as much as by law. In later accounts, Diamond is remembered as unusually social, someone who could move between rooms, who could read a mood, who could make himself useful. Those traits don't appear from nowhere. In crowded neighborhoods, social intelligence is currency. You learn when to talk, when to disappear, When to laugh at a joke you don't find funny because you can't afford to insult the wrong person. And you learn performance. The nickname Legs, which will follow him like a shadow, is often linked in popular retellings to his dancing, his ability to cut loose in clubs, to make himself visible in a way that wasn't just swagger but spectacle. Biographers repeat the idea because it fits. The gangster as showman, the underworld as theater. But even if the origin is less clean than the stories claim, the point remains that Diamond understood something essential about the 1920s before the 1920s fully arrived. Attention is power, and style can operate like armor. 1-2. Yet style doesn't pay rent by itself. As Diamond moves into adolescence, the city offers two broad paths that are often presented as opposites but feel, on the ground, like parallel tracks. One is legitimate labor, hard, underpaid, and physically draining. The other is the street economy, petty theft, hustles, protection rackets in miniature, the informal commerce of stolen goods and favors. In neighborhoods where the line between business and scheme is thin, young men are recruited not with speeches but with small chances. A quick job, a lookout role, a run across town, an introduction to someone who takes care of his friends. This is where Diamond's temperament matters. The historical record doesn't require us to romanticize him to recognize a pattern seen in many rising figures of the era: ambition paired with impatience. The lure isn't only money, it's momentum. It's the feeling that life is happening now, not after 10 years of saving. If you're trying to understand how someone like Diamond is made, it helps to look at the city's relationship with vice long before Prohibition. New York already has an ecosystem: gambling, prostitution, and politically protected saloons. Reform movements surge, then recede. Police crackdowns happen, then soften. The public mood is inconsistent, outraged one week, indifferent the next. In that world, a young man can conclude, logically, that enforcement is negotiable, and morality is often a costume people put on for the daytime. Then the nation adds a new ingredient: a constitutional ban on alcohol. The 18th Amendment is ratified in 1919, and the National Prohibition Act, better known as the Volstead Act, sets the rules for enforcement. In January 1920, Prohibition becomes the law of the land. 3-4, whatever one thinks of the policy, its impact on urban crime is straightforward. It turns a widely desired product into contraband overnight. Demand doesn't vanish. It goes looking for suppliers who can operate outside the law, protect distribution, and manage risk. For the underworld, this is not just a new market, it's an industrial-scale upgrade. And for a man like Diamond, young, socially adept, comfortable around nightlife, the timing is everything. But before Prohibition fully ignites his trajectory, there's another shaping force that touches many men of his age: the First World War. The United States enters the war in 1917. Military service, training camps, the movement of huge numbers of young men. This is a national disruption, and it can serve as a rough kind of schooling. Some accounts describe Diamond as having served during this period, with the usual caveat that later underworld biographies sometimes inflate or blur details. 1-2, whether he saw combat or simply absorbed the discipline and networks that come with wartime mobilization, the era changes the social landscape he returns to. Men come home older, often hardened, sometimes restless. The city's nightlife booms. The taste for risk feels, to some, less like recklessness and more like proof of being alive. In the early 1920s, that mood becomes a kind of weather. Speakeasies multiply. Clubs open and close like matchbooks struck and tossed. A new class of operator appears. Not the old ward boss exactly, not the old saloon keeper, but the broker. Someone who can arrange supply, pay off the right people, and keep a place running without attracting the wrong kind of attention. Around them are layers of labor: drivers, lookouts, cash collectors, and men hired to enforce agreements when agreements stop being enough. Diamond edges into this world the way many do, not as a kingpin, but as a useful man, someone who can be trusted with a task, someone who is willing to show up, someone whose social confidence makes him effective in rooms where nerves can ruin business. The historical sources that cover him tend to agree on the broad outline. He becomes involved in bootlegging-era rackets and builds a reputation in the orbit of larger operators, rising as prohibition turns street crime into organized enterprise. 1-2. It's important, though, not to let the later legend rewrite the early reality. For every flashy night that the stories like to emphasize, there are quieter mornings. A mother watching her son slip away from ordinary work, a neighborhood that learns to keep its eyes down, small businesses pressured by the presence of men who call it protection. The social cost of this era isn't just in court records. It's in the daily tension of living around people who treat the law as optional and treat consequences as something that happens to other families. Diamond in this early phase is not yet the figure the newspapers will fixate on. He is assembling himself, collecting contacts, learning which doors open, learning which names to drop, learning the etiquette of corruption without ever calling it that. In a city where political machines and vice networks have long shared the same streets, a young man doesn't need a manifesto. He needs an introduction. And introductions are everywhere in Prohibition, New York. The waterfront is especially instructive. Docks are natural choke points. Goods arrive, goods disappear, and everyone involved can claim they were just doing their job. The geography of the harbor teaches a lesson the underworld will exploit for the entire decade. If you can control movement, trucks, warehouses, routes, you can control profit. You can also control who gets blamed when something goes wrong. Diamond's early reputation, such as it is, grows in this atmosphere. The sense that he is hard to pin down, socially fluent, and increasingly entangled in a cash economy built on a law many citizens privately ignore while publicly endorsing. Those contradictions don't excuse anything, but they explain why prohibition is such a powerful engine for people like him. The law isn't merely something to break. It's something that reshapes incentives, inviting corruption and rewarding the bold. By the mid-1920s, the name Legs Diamond will begin to travel farther than the neighborhoods that produced him. It will move through police stations and courtrooms, through gossip columns and backroom conversations, through the mouths of people who enjoy repeating a dangerous story because it makes the city feel alive. But at the start, it's simpler. It's a young man in a crowded, electric city, discovering that the quickest ladder is often the one built from other people's fear, and that once you start climbing, it becomes harder to step back down into ordinary life. By the early 1920s, New York had learned how to live with contradictions. The law said one thing, the night said another. Restaurants served coffee that didn't smell like coffee. Social clubs collected dues that seemed to rise and fall with the city's thirst. Delivery trucks rolled at odd hours, their routes shaped less by traffic than by who had been paid to look away. In that world, Jack Diamond didn't need to invent a new kind of crime. Prohibition had already done that. All he had to do was recognize what it rewarded. The reward went to people who could move between crowds without drawing attention, who could talk their way past a door one night and intimidate the same door the next. It went to people comfortable in the half-lit spaces where legitimate business and vice didn't just meet, but overlapped, sharing landlords, sharing attorneys, sometimes sharing political patrons. Later reference works describe Diamond's early Prohibition years as a period of apprenticeship and networking. He drifted into the circles that ran hijackings, protection, and liquor distribution, and he proved useful enough to keep getting called back. He wasn't the architect yet. He was an implement, sharp, ambitious, and increasingly expensive to keep around. 1-2. What made him noticeable, even before he was famous, was that he understood the era's most practical truth. Reputation could be leveraged like money. He cultivated visibility in the nightlife that Prohibition couldn't extinguish. Clubs, dance floors, and back rooms offered him two things at once: social cover and social reach. One night you were a customer, the next you were introduced as a friend. And if you were a friend to the right operator, doors opened in a city built on doors. This is where the nickname Legs begins to matter, regardless of its precise origin. The legend of Diamond as a standout dancer is repeated so often because it fits the larger pattern. He moved in places where performance and business were inseparable. A man who could command a room could also calm a room, or unsettle it, without ever raising his voice. 1-2. But the real escalation, the thing that turns a street-hardened hustler into a major prohibition figure, was the scale of the alcohol economy itself. Prohibition didn't end drinking, it reclassified it. The 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act created an enormous illegal market, and illegal markets don't run on vibes. They run on logistics, supply lines, warehouses, trucks, bribes, lookouts. Accountants, lawyers, and when deals broke or rivals pushed, men who could enforce decisions. 3-4. Diamond found his way into that structure. Many accounts place him in the orbit of prominent racketeers of the decade, including Arnold Rothstein, the famed gambling and underworld financier who operated less like a street brawler and more like a businessman with a talent for corruption. Reference works commonly describe Diamond as having worked in roles like bodyguard and enforcer for higher-level figures, jobs that paid in cash and connections, but also put a target on a man's back. 1-2. If you imagine the underworld as a pyramid, Diamond's early climb wasn't a neat ascent up the center. It was lateral movement across crews and schemes, taking whatever job brought him closer to the rooms where decisions were made. He learned what those rooms valued. They valued discretion until they needed spectacle. They valued loyalty until the numbers changed. They valued order, the kind that kept shipments moving until ambition introduced chaos. And the city itself fed that chaos. Bootlegging wasn't one business. It was dozens of businesses, layered and competing. There were importers and middlemen, speakeasy owners and delivery crews, hijackers who treated liquor trucks like rolling banks, and politicians who wanted prohibition to work publicly while quietly enjoying its donations. The constant friction between these layers created a steady demand for men like Diamond, men who could be sent where a contract couldn't. The cost of this system wasn't abstract. It landed in neighborhoods where intimidation became background noise, where legitimate shopkeepers paid to avoid trouble, where witnesses weighed the price of honesty. Diamond's rise is part of that larger harm. Even when he wasn't the one running an operation, he was an ingredient that made operations harder to resist. And as his name circulated, so did his legal troubles. Diamond's reputation for repeated arrests followed by acquittals or dismissed charges became part of his public myth, an image reinforced by the era's tabloid press and by later summaries of his career. The cleanest way to say it, historically, is this: he was frequently in conflict with law enforcement, and he proved unusually difficult to keep behind bars for long. Contemporary explanations ranged from weak evidence to uncooperative witnesses to the ambient corruption of prohibition enforcement itself, conditions that shaped many major cases of the 1920s, not just Diamond's. 125. These courtroom cycles did something important for him. They taught him that the legal system was not merely a threat. It was another arena, one where money, connections, and timing could matter as much as guilt. Every avoided conviction added a layer to his aura. To admirers, it looked like luck. To enemies, it looked like a man who couldn't be stopped. To the police, it looked like a growing problem, someone accumulating notoriety faster than they could build a case. In the middle of the decade, Diamond's underworld connections widened into labor and garment district rackets, especially through his association with Little Augie Origin, a figure linked in multiple accounts to labor-related extortion and enforcement in New York's garment trade. Diamond is often described as part of Origin's muscle, another step in Diamond's pattern, aligning with men who had systems, then becoming one of the people those systems relied on to function. 1-2. It's here that the story becomes less romantic than the nicknames suggest. Labor racketeering wasn't just gangsters versus gangsters. It spilled into working people's lives. Strikes pressured through fear, contracts twisted by coercion, ordinary wages made contingent on the demands of men with no legitimate claim to anyone's labor. These operations fed on the city's most basic vulnerability, people needing jobs, and they helped normalize the idea that force, or the threat of it, belonged in economic negotiation. Diamond, by reputation and by repeated association, was comfortable in that environment. He was becoming, in effect, a specialist, the kind of man others hired when they needed outcomes they couldn't achieve legally. Then came the kind of incident that transforms a gangster from a name in police files into a story the public repeats. In 1927, Little Augie Origin was killed, an event widely noted in later underworld histories of the period. Diamond was frequently mentioned in the swirl of suspicion that followed, partly because he was close to Origin's world, partly because Prohibition-era murders rarely stayed confined to the people who pulled the trigger. They rearranged alliances, triggered retaliation, and created vacancies that ambitious men rushed to fill. 1-2. Whether Diamond benefited directly from Origin's death or simply survived the reshuffling, the outcome was clear. The underworld around him became more unstable, and instability is dangerous for someone with his visibility. The more people knew his name, the more useful he was, and the more he was treated as a problem to be removed. Around this time, Diamond's legend began to gather one of its most persistent themes: the man who kept coming back. Later accounts describe episodes in which Diamond was abducted or attacked and survived, events that fed the indestructible aura the press loved, even as they underscored a simpler reality. The life he'd chosen made him a constant target. 1-2, these were not cinematic trials of toughness. They were warnings in the blunt language of the underworld. You are overextended, you are in the way, or you know too much. For Diamond, survival didn't bring peace. It brought attention. Attention brought rivals. Rivals brought pressure. Pressure brought movement. By the late 1920s, another defining shift hit Diamond's world: the fall of Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein was shot in 1928 and later died, an underworld milestone that signaled how quickly Prohibition fortunes could turn, even for the most insulated figures. 126, with Rothstein gone, the networks he financed and stabilized began to reconfigure. Men who had worked under larger umbrellas suddenly faced a choice: attach themselves to a new patron, attempt to operate independently, or relocate to spaces where the heat felt lower and the opportunities still looked big. Diamond leaned into the third option. Accounts of his career commonly note that he expanded operations beyond Manhattan, spending significant time upstate, Albany and the surrounding region, where proximity to roots from Canada and a different local political environment made the bootlegging economy attractive. 1-2, this wasn't retreat so much as repositioning, a way to keep earning while the city's attention tightened around him. And yet the move carried its own risks. Smaller cities could be more permissive, but they could also be more controlled. In a place where power was concentrated, a newcomer with a big reputation didn't blend in. He stood out. He disrupted existing arrangements. He threatened local rackets and embarrassed local officials who preferred their corruption quiet. Diamond, as ever, had a talent for being both charismatic and difficult to absorb. By the end of the decade, he was no longer just an ambitious Prohibition-era operator. He was becoming a public character, someone the newspapers could summarize in a phrase, someone jurors might recognize, someone rival crews discussed not only as a competitor but as an ongoing headache. The city that made him had also made him impossible to contain. And as he tried to build a base beyond New York's brightest lights, closer to the state capital, closer to the border routes, closer to a quieter kind of influence. He carried with him the one thing that never stayed quiet for long: his name. Albany did not advertise itself as a frontier town. It was the state capital: law books, marble buildings, committee rooms, and men who wore respectability like a uniform. Compared to Manhattan's neon heat, Albany's nights could seem almost restrained. Fewer crowds, fewer headlines, a slower rhythm along the Hudson. But Prohibition had taught the country a strange lesson. The loudest places weren't always the most important. Sometimes the real pressure points were quieter, where routes converged, where enforcement was inconsistent, where politics could be local enough to manage. That was the appeal. By the end of the 1920s, Jack Legs, Diamond's life in New York City had become a tangle of attention. Rivals who knew his face, police who knew his name, and a press culture that treated flamboyant criminals as copyrighted characters. Reference works consistently describe him pushing north and spending significant time in the Albany area as he expanded his bootlegging footprint beyond the city. It wasn't a clean break from New York's underworld so much as an attempt to widen his operating space. More territory, more distance from the most concentrated heat, and new opportunities along upstate corridors that mattered to liquor traffic. Geography made the temptation obvious. Upstate New York sat within reach of Canadian supply lines and Lake River routes that could feed distribution into the city and across the Northeast. Prohibition turned transportation into a form of power, and any place that connected roads, rail lines, and waterways became valuable. 3. Albany, with its political gravity and its position in the state's infrastructure, offered a kind of strategic camouflage. A busy governmental city where strangers could pass through without looking inherently suspicious, so long as they didn't insist on being noticed. Diamond, unfortunately for his own safety, often insisted on being noticed. Even when he tried to present himself as a businessman, better clothes, better hotels, better tables, his reputation traveled ahead of him. In smaller cities, notoriety can be louder than in New York. A face that would dissolve into the crowd in Manhattan could become a subject of conversation in an Albany lobby. And Diamond wasn't just passing through. He was attempting to set down a stake. That meant he was stepping into a place that already had its own arrangements. Prohibition-era liquor didn't move through empty space. It moved through local ecosystems. Friendly bartenders, nervous landlords, drivers who knew back roads, and officials who understood, at minimum, the difference between enforcement as a public statement and enforcement as a private practice. Historians of Prohibition have emphasized how uneven enforcement and corruption pressures shaped the era nationwide, particularly in cities where political machines could influence policing priorities. 3. Diamond didn't invent those conditions, but he used them. Upstate also offered something else: fewer competing celebrity criminals. In New York City, Diamond was one more ambitious operator in a crowded field. In Albany, he could plausibly become the most famous man in the room. That wasn't just vanity. Fame could be a tool. A notorious name could scare smaller rivals, attract useful hangers-on, and persuade cautious partners that you had reach. But fame cut both ways. In Prohibition, reach was exactly what other crews feared. An outsider with a big reputation looked less like a businessman and more like an invasive species. He threatened existing profits and unsettled existing compromises. Even people who didn't care about morality cared deeply about stability. Diamond's presence upstate created a new kind of tension, not the constant street-level friction of Manhattan, but the brittle tension of a smaller stage where everyone knew who was supposed to be in charge. And then, as often happened to men who lived by intimidation and negotiation in equal measure, Diamond discovered that not every conflict could be settled with talk. In 1930, Diamond became the victim of a widely reported kidnapping and attack, an episode that later summaries treat as a turning point in his national image. the man who seemed unable to stay down, no matter how hard the underworld tried to remove him. 1-2, the newspaper seized the story because it fit the era's appetite for larger-than-life criminals, and Diamond, who had always understood the value of attention, became even more of a public character. But beneath the headlines was a colder reality. Abduction wasn't theater. It was a message with only a few possible meanings. You're overreaching. You're not protected. You've angered someone with resources, or you know something you shouldn't. These weren't moral judgments. They were business judgments delivered in the bluntest language that underworld commerce allowed. Diamond survived, and survival did not solve the problem, it sharpened it. Every time he outlasted an attempt on his life, the legend grew, but so did the incentives for someone to try again. A failed attempt doesn't end a feud, it escalates it. It adds humiliation to the original motive, and it tells every rival watching that the job still needs doing. The press also played its part in tightening the vice. Prohibition-era produced a strange feedback loop between crime and celebrity. Reporters wanted vivid characters. The public wanted stories. Law enforcement wanted results. And criminals, especially the ones with egos big enough to fill a ballroom, sometimes wanted the attention too, until the attention turned into surveillance. Diamond's very public survivals helped cement a nickname in the public mind. The clay pigeon, a phrase later works repeat to capture both the frequency of attempts on him and the way he became a walking provocation. 1-2, it sounded like folklore, but it was really a measure of how many enemies he had accumulated and how precarious his position had become. While Diamond battled the invisible war of rivals and retaliation, he also fought the visible war of courts and police stations. Reference works on Diamond consistently emphasized the pattern: frequent arrests, charges that sounded serious, and outcomes that often failed to keep him incarcerated for long. 1-2, some of that reflects the era's investigative limits. Some reflects witness intimidation, a real and documented problem in organized crime prosecutions. 3, some reflects the simple difficulty of proving complex conspiracies in court, especially when the illegal product was everywhere, and the lines between customer, employee, and partner were deliberately blurred. And some of it, in Diamond's case, reflects something more personal. He was slippery. Diamond understood how to use the city's systems against themselves. He could afford lawyers. He could exploit jurisdictional confusion between local police and federal prohibition enforcement. He could benefit from the reluctance of witnesses to become names in the paper. The result wasn't magic. It was Prohibition's structural weakness made visible in one man's career. But those legal evasions also came with a cost. They irritated everyone. They irritated police who felt mocked. They irritated judges who felt their courtrooms used as stages. They irritated reformers who saw him as evidence that prohibition had turned law into an argument rather than a boundary. And they irritated rival criminals who concluded that Diamond, loud, famous, hard to convict, was bringing heat down on entire regions. By 1930, the temperature around him had climbed high enough that Albany's quiet no longer mattered. He moved through the upstate world like a man trying to balance on a wire, maintaining business contacts, maintaining social visibility, maintaining the illusion that he could still enjoy a drink and a dance and a laugh without consequences. But the era was not forgiving, and Diamond was not cautious enough to be invisible. Even his social life became part of the problem. Prohibition nightlife functioned as a marketplace. Deals made over music, disputes handled in side rooms, alliances measured by who sat at whose table. Diamond thrived in that environment, yet the same rooms that helped him operate also made him easier to find. Fame has an address. If you want to be seen, someone else can see you too. Meanwhile, the broader prohibition landscape was changing. The late 1920s and early 1930s brought growing public exhaustion with the experiment. an increasing sense that the law had empowered criminals and fostered corruption rather than sobriety. 3. That cultural shift didn't immediately help men like Diamond. In the short term, it made enforcement more politically fraught. Crackdowns could be demanded in speeches, resented in private, and undermined behind the scenes. It created a climate where the public wanted results, and police departments wanted a trophy case, high-profile names, high-profile convictions. Diamond was exactly the kind of name that looked good on a press release. So he faced pressure from above and below at once, rivals who wanted him removed and authorities who wanted him contained. The two forces didn't cooperate, but they didn't have to. They squeezed the same target from different sides. And by the early 1930s, the squeeze began to show in Diamond's behavior. He was still out, still social, still playing the part, but increasingly he lived like a man who knew the floor could drop at any time. He shifted locations. He relied on associates. He attempted to outpace the consequences of his own notoriety by moving his operations and his body through space, as if mobility itself were safety. But mobility is not safety when the conflict follows you. Albany's advantages, its roots, its politics, its quieter streets, could not solve Diamond's central problem. He had become too famous to be merely useful. He was now symbolic. To police, he symbolized Prohibition's failures. To rivals, he symbolized instability and unwanted attention. To the press, he symbolized a kind of violent glamour that sold papers even as it distorted reality. And to the people living ordinary lives in the neighborhoods where he operated, he symbolized something simpler. The way Prohibition-era crime could bend a community's atmosphere, making every late-night car door and every unfamiliar face feel like a warning. By the end of this chapter, one thing was unmistakable. The upstate move hadn't lowered the stakes, it had raised them. Diamond had tried to outrun Manhattan's spotlight by stepping onto a smaller stage. Instead, he became the main act, and in Prohibition America, that meant the next crisis wasn't a matter of asterisk if asterisk. It was a matter of who would reach him first, the courtroom, or the people who had already tried to take him off the board. Albany liked to think of itself as a city of paper. Bills became laws here. Promises became appointments. Arguments became budgets. The machinery of government gave the place a steadier rhythm than New York City's improvisational roar, and that steadiness had value, especially in the Prohibition years, when order was as much a political brand as it was a civic need. But Prohibition had also taught every American city the same uncomfortable lesson. Paper did not stop liquor. It only changed who profited from it. By 1930, Jack Legs Diamond had drifted far enough upstate that he was no longer a rumor in Albany. He was a presence, visible, talked about, and increasingly disruptive. Later reference works consistently describe him as operating in the region, drawn by the opportunities of upstate distribution and the comparative room to maneuver away from Manhattan's constant police attention. Yet room to maneuver was not the same thing as room to misbehave. Albany's quiet came with strings attached, and Diamond had a habit of pulling at strings until something snapped. He carried into town the very thing Albany's power brokers least wanted, national-style notoriety. In New York City, flamboyance could dissolve into the crowd. In Albany, flamboyance put a spotlight on everyone standing near you. And Diamond didn't just attract attention from the press and the police. He attracted attention from the local systems that survived on controlled visibility, political networks that preferred their arrangements stable, deniable, and dull. That was the essential mismatch. Diamond's survival strategy had become celebrity. Albany's survival strategy was the opposite. The pressure on him tightened after one incident in particular, an episode that became central to the Legs Diamond public image and helped fix him in the national imagination as the man who wouldn't go away. In 1930, Diamond was kidnapped and seriously harmed by unknown assailants, an event described in multiple later summaries of his career and treated as a landmark in his legend. He was found alive, recovered, and returned, an outcome that fed the myth that he was somehow harder to eliminate than other men in his line of work. 1, 2, 3. It's tempting, especially in hindsight, to treat that survival as a kind of gangster folklore, the unstoppable outlaw, the man too tough to lose. But the reality is less cinematic and more revealing. Kidnapping in this world wasn't a spontaneous outburst. It was an organized act with a message embedded in it. And the message was, you're famous. The message was, you're exposed. Diamond's response to surviving was, in keeping with his personality, to keep moving and keep performing. For men like him, recovery wasn't merely physical, it was reputational. If you looked frightened, you invited more pressure. If you looked triumphant, you signaled that the attempt had failed. So he leaned into the persona the newspapers liked, the sharp dresser, the nightlife regular, the man who seemed to treat danger as an inconvenience. Accounts of Diamond's life repeatedly stressed that his notoriety was part of his operating style, not an accident. 1, 2, he understood that fame could make people hesitate. It might even convince a few partners that he was protected by forces they couldn't see. But in Albany, that same fame worked like a siren. It told everyone, rivals, police, political fixers, that Diamond was bringing outside turbulence into a smaller, more tightly managed ecosystem. In a capital city where political power was intensely local and deeply organized, the presence of a nationally known racketeer wasn't just embarrassing, it was destabilizing. Albany in this era is often described by historians through the lens of its democratic political machine, identified closely with Daniel P. O'Connell, whose influence over city and county politics became a defining feature of local power for decades. Four-machine politics did not require every official to be corrupt, but it did require predictability. Problems managed quietly, scandals minimized, loyalty rewarded. A figure like Diamond, chaotic, headline-friendly, allergic to discretion, fit badly inside that logic. He didn't just violate the law, he violated the machine's preference for quiet. So the city's patience began to run out. Law enforcement pressure, already intense in the Prohibition years, took on a more personal edge when a criminal's presence felt like a deliberate provocation. And the press, especially in the late Prohibition period, when public frustration with bootlegging and corruption was widespread, was hungry for a story that looked like action. 5 Diamond gave them action simply by existing in the wrong place with the wrong reputation. The legal conflict that followed him was not a single case but a cycle. Arrests, hearings, courtroom appearances, releases, repeated often enough that it became part of his public identity. Later reference works emphasize this pattern as a hallmark of Diamond's career. Authorities repeatedly tried to pin serious charges on him, and yet he repeatedly returned to the street. 1, 2, 3, the reasons are rarely reducible to a single explanation. Prohibition-era enforcement was fragmented. Evidence was difficult, witnesses were reluctant, defense attorneys were skilled, and juries faced with sensational defendants could be unpredictable. 5. Still, to the public, the nuance didn't matter. The repeated courtroom returns created a simple storyline. Diamond always slipped out. And that storyline made him more dangerous, not because it proved he was untouchable, but because it convinced his enemies that law alone wouldn't remove him. Then came another episode that reinforced the same theme: violence as punctuation in a life that had begun to read like a serial. In late 1930 or 1931, accounts vary on the precise timing, Diamond was shot in New York City at the Hotel Monticello and survived, an event widely repeated in biographical summaries and Underworld reference works. 1, 2, 3 once again, the details that would satisfy a crime reporter mattered less than the implication. Someone reached him in a public place, on a night when he thought he was safe enough to be seen. He survived again. Each survival did 2 things at once. It strengthened the legend, and it narrowed his future. Because surviving an attempt does not erase the motive behind it, it deepens it. To a rival crew, a failed attempt is not just a failure, it's an insult. To police and prosecutors, it's evidence of escalating disorder. To local political actors, it's a flashing sign that says, your city is now part of a larger war. Diamond's life after these attacks became a sequence of pivots, moving between locations, leaning on associates, trying to keep business running while the people around him quietly reassessed whether he was worth the trouble. The same traits that helped him rise, boldness, showmanship, constant motion, were now liabilities. A man who wants to be seen is a man who can be found. And in Albany, he could be found more easily than he liked. What made his situation especially precarious was the way different kinds of enemies began to overlap. In New York City, he had rivals who wanted market share and revenge. Upstate, he ran into another category, people who cared less about the liquor business than about the city's political equilibrium. Diamond threatened that equilibrium simply by drawing attention. Even if he paid bribes, even if he kept deals, even if he avoided open conflict, his name alone was a problem, because his name came with reporters, investigators, and federal interest. This is where the myth of the indestructible Diamond starts to look, from another angle, like isolation. A man can't live on legend. He has to live on agreements, and agreements depend on trust that you won't bring disaster to the people doing business with you. By 1931, Diamond was becoming the kind of partner who might make you money, but might also make you a headline. In a small city ecosystem, headlines were expensive. So the social conflict sharpened. People talked. People warned him. People distanced themselves. And Diamond, proud, restless, and convinced that the next clever move would reset the board, kept insisting that he could outmaneuver forces that were no longer playing by the same rules he was. The deeper truth was that Diamond had started to confuse two different kinds of success. He thought beating cases meant beating consequences. But consequences were catching up in a form he couldn't cross-examine. As the months narrowed toward the end of 1931, Diamond's world took on that particular kind of late Prohibition unease, a sense that the era itself was changing. Public sentiment was shifting toward repeal. The bootlegging economy, still huge, was facing uncertainty about its long-term future. And in uncertain times, underworld politics often becomes more ruthless, not less. When tomorrow's profits are unclear, the urge to settle today's scores intensifies. Diamond was, in that climate, both a profitable operator and a walking provocation. Somewhere along the line, after the kidnappings, after the shootings, after the courtroom cycles, Albany stopped seeing him as a visitor and began seeing him as a threat to be managed. Whether that management would come through a clean legal victory or through something darker was the question hanging over his final year. And Diamond, for all his instincts, seemed unable or unwilling to hear what the city was telling him. It wasn't telling him he was invincible. It was telling him he was running out of places to stand. By 1931, Jack Legs Diamond was living inside a narrowing corridor. The Prohibition world that had once felt limitless, new routes, new partners, new clubs, new money, was turning into a map of constraints. Every city had people who wanted him gone. Every courthouse had someone willing to try. Every friendship carried the question Diamond could never fully answer. Are you here because you like me, or because you're waiting to see what happens to me? Upstate New York, which had once offered breathing room, now felt like a smaller room with fewer exits. Albany's political culture prized control and predictability. Diamond's personality prized motion and attention. He could be charming, even generous in the way some nightlife figures are generous, buying rounds, tipping well, acting like the room belonged to him. But charm is not the same thing as acceptance, and a man does not become famous for repeatedly surviving attacks without also becoming, to the people around him, a magnet for trouble. In the language of that era's underworld, Diamond had become hot. Not just in the sense that police watched him, many bootleggers lived with that, but in the deeper sense that his name, by itself, increased risk for anyone standing too close. The violence that had pursued him into 1930, kidnapping, then later the high-profile shooting at New York City's Hotel Monticello, didn't fade into the background. If anything, those episodes made him more of a focus for law enforcement and more of an irritation for rivals and political managers alike. Reference works treat these events as central to Diamond's public identity by the early 1930s, the hard-to-convict racketeer who seemed to absorb punishment and return to the dance floor. 1, 2, 3. But the world Diamond moved through was changing in another, quieter way. Public patience with Prohibition itself was wearing thin. By the early 1930s, the national conversation had shifted. The noble experiment was increasingly criticized for fostering corruption and empowering organized crime rather than ending drinking. Histories of the period emphasized that enforcement was uneven, politically contested, and often undermined by the sheer size of demand. For that shifting mood created a paradox for men like Diamond. In the long run, repeal threatened their biggest revenue stream. In the short run, it intensified pressure for visible results, because officials needed to prove that law still meant something. A notorious figure, with a headline-ready nickname, was exactly the kind of result ambitious prosecutors wanted. Diamond's legal problems had never been just about what he did. They were about what he represented. Prohibition's shadow economy made flesh, walking into court with expensive suits and a grin that suggested the system could be played. Later summaries of his career repeatedly stressed that arrests and courtroom appearances were a near constant, and that he often slipped through on acquittals or dismissals. 1, 2, the pattern made him famous, but it also changed the way authorities approached him. In a case against an ordinary bootlegger, a prosecutor could hope for compliance, plea deals, testimony, quiet convictions. With Diamond, quiet was no longer an option. Every proceeding became, at minimum, a public test of whether the state could deliver on its own authority. So the pressure concentrated into a single objective: put him away or push him out. In 1931, that objective crystallized in a major legal confrontation upstate, Diamond facing serious charges in a courtroom that was not Manhattan's familiar stage, but the more controlled environment of the Capital District. Later reference works commonly describe him as standing trial in Troy, Rensselaer County, near the end of 1931 on kidnapping-related charges, and being acquitted shortly before his death. 1, 2, 3. The details of exactly how the case was built, witnesses, timelines, what could be proven beyond reasonable doubt, are the kinds of things that decide outcomes but don't always survive cleanly in later summaries. What does survive is the shape of the moment. A high-profile defendant, a region tired of his presence, and a prosecution that needed to make the charges stick. And what made it especially volatile was that the trial wasn't only a legal event, it was a social referendum. To the public, Diamond's repeated returns, after arrests had become a story unto itself, fed by tabloid rhythms and the era's fascination with criminal celebrity. 1, 2, to the police, each acquittal wasn't merely a loss, it was demoralizing and politically damaging. To the local power brokers who benefited from stability, it was embarrassing. The state capital region becoming a stage for a nationally notorious gangster. The courthouse in Troy, then, was not just a building. It was a boundary line. Either Diamond would finally be contained by the formal system, or the informal systems around him would conclude that formal containment was unlikely. Diamond understood that too. He could play the courtroom game. He had lawyers. He had practiced expressions, confident, amused, indignant. He knew how to look like a man being unfairly targeted, and he knew how to let the public's general skepticism that prohibition enforcement was as political as it was moral, work to his advantage. For, if jurors didn't love him, he didn't necessarily need them to. He only needed them to doubt. That is a thin edge to balance on, but Diamond had balanced on thin edges for years. Still, the Troy trial carried a different weight from the earlier cases that had bounced off him. This one was local enough that it couldn't be shrugged off as New York City business. It was close to where he'd been operating, close to where he'd been seen, close to the place he was trying, against every sign, to turn into a base. That closeness made it harder to hide behind the glamour of distance. Albany and Troy weren't abstract to jurors, they were home. In the shadows around the courtroom, other calculations ran parallel to the legal ones. Because Diamond's continued presence upstate posed a different kind of threat than it did in Manhattan. New York City was built to absorb noise. It had 1,000 loud stories at once. In the Capital District, a loud story could swallow the whole town. Local businesses didn't want their names in a gangster saga. Politicians didn't want reporters sniffing around their donors and their alliances. Police departments didn't want their failures showcased. The people who could tolerate a local vice economy could still detest the kind of national scrutiny Diamond attracted. This is where the era's politics matters, not as a conspiracy cartoon, but as a lived reality of machine governance. Albany's long-running political organization, widely associated in historical reference works with Daniel P. O'Connell, depended on keeping the city governable and its scandals containable. 5 Whether or Not One attributes specific acts to the machine. The overall structure produced a predictable incentive. Remove unpredictable elements. Diamond was unpredictability personified. He was also, by late 1931, dangerously convinced of his own momentum. There's a particular kind of arrogance that grows in a man who has survived things that should have ended him. Diamond's survival fed an internal logic. If I can survive this, I can survive anything. That logic is intoxicating, and it can look like courage from the outside, but it's often just the absence of fear where fear would be useful. As the trial proceeded, Diamond's presence became a kind of civic weather system. People in the nightlife scene watched it like gamblers watching a race. If he beat the case, some would treat it as proof he still had power. If he lost, others would scramble to fill the vacuum. The police watched for the same reason predators watch a herd. A wounded animal changes the whole ecosystem. Then the verdict came. Diamond was acquitted. The result, as it appears in later summaries of his career, was almost too perfect for the myth. One more courtroom escape, one more moment when the public could say, he slipped again. 1, 2, 3. If you are building a legend, an acquittal is a gift. It makes you look untouchable without requiring you to do anything at all. But if you are trying to stay alive, an acquittal can be a curse. Because it didn't resolve the underlying conflicts, it didn't make rivals disappear, it didn't soothe the anger of law enforcement, it didn't make the local political class feel safer, it didn't even necessarily make his own partners feel secure. It only made one thing clear. The system had failed, again, to remove him in the clean way. And when the clean way fails often enough, people start imagining unclean alternatives. Diamond left the courthouse still breathing, still free, still, at least outwardly, himself. One can picture him doing what he always did after surviving something, heading back into the social spaces where he felt most in control. The clubs, the rooms where music blurred edges, the places where a notorious name could be turned into applause. That impulse was part defiance and part habit. Diamond's public life had always been a statement. I'm not hiding. In his mind, hiding would have been a kind of surrender. But in late 1931, not hiding was also a kind of gamble. Because the acquittal didn't just frustrate his enemies. It clarified their incentives. It told the people who wanted him gone that they couldn't count on the courts to do it soon, if ever. It told the people who wanted peace that he wasn't leaving on his own. And it told the people who profited from stability that Diamond was now a recurring crisis. In the immediate aftermath, the air around him changed. Not in a way you could photograph, not in a way a newspaper headline could precisely capture, but in the way a room goes quieter when the wrong person walks in the way conversations pause, in the way someone who used to laugh too loud now laughs carefully. Diamond famously could misread that kind of quiet. Or perhaps he read it correctly and refused to accept it. Either way, the days after the Troy acquittal carried the heavy feeling of an ending not yet spoken aloud. He was still alive, still in motion, still believing to some degree that his story could continue because it always had. But history is not obligated to honor momentum. Prohibition's great irony is that it created men who built empires on illegality and then convinced them those empires were permanent. By 1931, Diamond's empire wasn't permanent. It wasn't even stable. It was a chain of contested roots, shaky alliances, and grudges that wouldn't cool. And the Capital District, this region of paper and power, had reached the point where one more headline felt like too many. Diamond had beaten the case. Now he had to survive the consequences of beating it. The trouble with surviving your own legend is that it doesn't let you rest. When Jack Legs Diamond walked out of the Troy courthouse a free man after his late 1931 acquittal, the legal system had once again failed to deliver a clean ending. In the narrow logic of tabloid storytelling, it looked like another escape act, another wink at the public, another humiliation for the state. Later reference works treat that acquittal as one of the final beats in the Diamond saga, the moment that should have lowered the temperature, but instead pushed it higher. 1, 2, 3. Because acquittal didn't mean safety, it meant unresolved pressure. And pressure in Diamond's world always looked for a release. In the Capital District, the weeks after the trial were thick with the kind of talk that never gets written down cleanly. The city's nightlife, its bars operating under polite fictions, its hotel rooms where deals were just conversations, carried gossip the way cigarette smoke carries light. Diamond had friends, or at least companions. He also had men who watched him because watching was their job, and men who watched him because watching was their curiosity. The police watched him for simpler reasons. He was a recurring civic embarrassment. Albany's power structure, shaped by machine politics and the constant priority of keeping scandal containable, had no reason to enjoy his presence. Historical reference works on New York state politics emphasize how local organizations, especially in cities like Albany, depended on discipline and predictability. 4. Diamond was neither. Wherever he went, he brought the possibility of headlines, investigations, and questions no one in power wanted asked. And he brought something else, instability. Even if you strip away the romance and the gossip, prohibition crime ran on agreements, quiet understandings about routes, suppliers, payoffs, and the boundaries between crews. A flamboyant outsider with a national reputation disturbed those understandings just by existing. He made local arrangements harder to manage, because outsiders bring outside wars with them. Diamond had spent years collecting enemies the way other men collected suits. Rivals resented his expansion. Former associates resented old slights. Police resented his acquittals. Local political actors resented the attention. And Diamond himself, restless, proud, and used to getting away with things, didn't help his case by behaving like a man who feared consequences. He behaved like a man who believed the story still belonged to him. There's a pattern that shows up again and again in Prohibition biographies. A gangster survives a major attempt on his life, survives another, beats a case, beats another, and then begins to treat survival as proof of permanence. Diamond's biography is saturated with those beats: the 1930 kidnapping, the Hotel Monticello shooting, the repeated courtroom returns. 1, 2, 3. The effect was that Diamond began to seem less like a person and more like a problem the era couldn't solve. Then, in mid-December 1931, the problem was solved, not by a verdict but by a doorway. Accounts agree on the essential fact. Diamond was shot in Albany and died shortly afterward on December 18, 1931. 123 He was staying at a rooming house on Dove Street, an unglamorous detail that matters because it undercuts the myth. For all the expensive nights and flashy stories, the final chapter wasn't written in a nightclub spotlight. It was written in a place that could have belonged to any working city. A rented room, a shared hallway, a building where neighbors learned to mind their business. The attack itself is often described in later summaries with the bluntness of a police report. Assailants reached him, shots were fired, and he was taken to the hospital. 123 It's not necessary to dwell on the mechanics to understand what it meant. It meant that whoever wanted him gone had found the moment when he was most ordinary, alone enough, accessible enough, unprotected enough. And it meant the long tug-of-war between Diamond and the forces around him. Rivals, law enforcement pressure, political impatience, had ended the only way such wars often ended in that era, not with closure but with silence. He died 2 days later. In the immediate aftermath, the city had to perform its own kind of balancing act. A notorious gangster had been killed in the state capital region, in the open secret environment of Prohibition, at a moment when public trust in enforcement was already strained. The authorities needed to look effective. The political class needed the story to stop growing. The underworld needed to understand what the removal of Diamond would change. And everyone, for different reasons, wanted the same outcome: no extended public unraveling. The investigation that followed did not deliver the satisfying ending audiences are trained to expect. As later reference works note, Diamond's killing became one of those Prohibition-era cases surrounded by rumor and competing claims, with no definitive public resolution that convinced everyone. 123 That lack of closure became part of the Diamond story as surely as his nickname did. In the vacuum, theories multiplied. Some pointed toward underworld rivals, men who had both motive and organizational capacity. Diamond had antagonized major figures, and his repeated survivals could easily have convinced competitors that they needed a more final solution. 2 other theories, repeated in later discussions of Albany's political culture, leaned on the idea that local power brokers might have wanted him removed for the sake of stability, less as a moral crusade than as a housekeeping decision. 4. But it's critical to treat that as what it is: informed speculation shaped by the era's known corruption pressures and by Albany's reputation for tightly managed politics, not a proven, courtroom-established fact. The honest historical center of gravity is narrower and harsher. Diamond had accumulated so many conflicts that, by late 1931, there was no shortage of people who could have wanted him gone. 123. His death, then, wasn't just the end of a man. It was an end point created by his own method. Prohibition rewarded speed, bravado, and the ability to intimidate. Diamond embraced those rewards, but that same posture, visibility, defiance, constant friction, also guaranteed that when the accounting came due, it would come due in a way the courts could not control. In the days that followed, the city exhaled, not in celebration, at least not publicly, but in relief. A source of chronic turbulence had disappeared. The capital district could try to return to its preferred state, a place where deals were quiet, where politics was local, and where the national press didn't circle like gulls. But the relief was not the same as resolution. Diamond's death did not end the liquor economy. It did not cleanse the region of corruption. It did not restore the ideal of prohibition. It simply removed one particularly flamboyant, particularly inconvenient node from a larger network that would continue until repeal rewired the incentives. And in a final irony that fits the era too well, the man who had spent years turning risk into reputation became, after death, something safer for the public to consume. A story, a cautionary tale, a character the papers had already practiced describing. In the next chapter, the question won't be, who was Legs Diamond? The headlines answered that in their own sensational language. The question will be what his disappearance revealed about the system that produced him, the way Prohibition blurred law and vice, the way local politics managed scandal, and the way America, nearing repeal, began to look back at the bodies of the decade and ask what exactly the country had been trying to accomplish. Diamond's legend ended in Albany, but the era that made him was still very much alive. Albany woke up the morning after Jack Legs Diamond was shot with a familiar, uneasy instinct: keep moving. The city had dealt with scandal before. It had dealt with vice before. It had dealt with the quiet hypocrisies of prohibition, public virtue, private drinking before. What made Diamond different was not that he broke the law. Plenty of people did. What made him different was that he carried his lawbreaking like a banner, and the banner drew outsiders, reporters, investigators, and curious strangers who came looking for the outline of a myth. Now the myth had a body. Diamond died on December 18, 1931, 2 days after the attack at the Dove Street rooming house where he'd been staying. That basic timeline is consistent across major reference summaries of his life. 1, 2, 3, and almost immediately, the life he'd lived began its second career, the part that didn't require him to be alive at all. Because Prohibition America had become very good at turning criminals into characters. Newspapers had spent the decade learning how to sell the underworld as narrative, nicknames, style, courtroom drama, the clash between law and racketeer framed like sport. Diamond had always been unusually compatible with that format. He dressed well. He moved through night spots. He returned from arrests and injuries with the stubborn refusal to vanish. Later encyclopedic sources stressed that his repeated acquittals and survivals were central to his public image. 1, 2. So when he died, the press didn't simply report a death. It reported the end of a serial. But the ending didn't behave like an ending. There was no neat confession, no public conviction that settled the question of who did it. The investigation did not deliver a single, universally accepted answer, and in the space where certainty should have been, rumor moved in. 1, 2, 3. That lack of closure was not unusual for the era. Prohibition cases were often hard to prove cleanly. Witnesses were afraid, loyalties were tangled, and the line between criminal worlds and political worlds could be uncomfortably thin. Histories of Prohibition emphasized that enforcement was fragmented and corruption pressures were constant, conditions that could complicate any high-profile inquiry, especially in a place that didn't want prolonged attention. 4. In the hours and days after Diamond's death, Albany had competing incentives pulling it in different directions. Police needed to look competent. The state capital could not afford the impression that a famous racketeer had been eliminated on its streets without consequence. Political leaders needed the story to stop expanding. And the underworld, local and imported, needed to know what the removal meant, whose territory had just opened up, whose authority had asserted itself, which alliances were now safer and which were now dangerous. Even Diamond's former associates would have felt the shift in practical terms. A man like Diamond was not just a person. He was a point of friction around which many smaller decisions rotated. Who to supply, who to avoid, who to pay, who to insult carefully, which club to enter and which to skip. With him gone, the friction changed shape. The most revealing thing about the public aftermath is how quickly the story split into versions. One version, the version most useful to the state, treated Diamond as a singular menace removed from the scene, a problem that had ended. That version was emotionally satisfying. It implied that the region could reset. Another version, the version most useful to reporters, treated Diamond's death as a mystery with a cast of suspects and a shadowy backdrop of politics, bootlegging, and revenge. That version extended the narrative, kept it profitable, and ensured Diamond would remain a name even without a pulse. A third version, the version most useful to the underworld, treated it as a message. The details mattered less than the outcome. Diamond, recently acquitted, newly free, and still defiant, was now gone. Anyone else tempted to behave the way he behaved should take the hint. Later summaries of Diamond's story reflect this fragmentation. They tend to agree on the core events: his upstate operations, the late 1931 acquittal in Troy, his shooting in Albany, and the fact that his killing was never cleanly resolved in a way that satisfied public curiosity. 1, 2, 3, but they also preserve the swirl of attribution: rival gangsters, local forces, or some combination of motives converging on a man who had collected too many enemies. If you're trying to remain historically honest, there's a line you can't cross: turning suspicion into fact. It is widely repeated in secondary accounts that different rivals had reasons to want Diamond gone. Some narratives point toward major New York underworld figures who had clashed with him, or viewed him as a destabilizing presence. Other narratives lean on the local political context: Albany's machine style of governance, often associated in historical references with Daniel P. O'Connell's long influence, arguing that a figure like Diamond would have been intolerable to a system built on controlled discretion. 5, but that interpretation is a framework, not a verdict. It explains why certain rumors flourished. It does not prove any one rumor true. What we can say with confidence is simpler and, in a way, more damning. Diamond's method of living made his death statistically unsurprising. He had spent years turning conflict into routine. Bootlegging-era business relied on coercion and retaliation as tools of market regulation, especially when legal contracts couldn't be enforced in court. Prohibition histories emphasize how the ban transformed alcohol into an engine for organized crime profits and violence, less because criminals were uniquely vicious, more because the market structure rewarded those willing to ignore legal restraint. 4, Diamond didn't cause that structure, but he operated as if it were permanent, and as if his personal charisma could keep him ahead of its consequences. The Great Depression deepened the atmosphere around all of this. By late 1931, the country was in the early years of economic collapse, and that collapse intensified everything: desperation, political scrutiny, public anger at corruption, the urge to find scapegoats, the pressure on law enforcement to demonstrate control. It also changed the emotional tone of crime stories. Earlier in the decade, some readers consumed gangster headlines as lurid entertainment. In the early 1930s, the same headlines could read like proof that the system was broken. The rich still drank, the poor still suffered, and criminals still seemed to buy their way out of consequences. Diamond's death landed in that mood like a punctuation mark. Not a moral punctuation mark. Prohibition wasn't suddenly vindicated, but a narrative one. The man who had made a career of seeming unkillable had been killed. That fact alone did work on the public imagination. It suggested limits. It suggested that the underworld had its own brutal accountability even when the courts struggled. It also suggested, to reformers and critics alike, that prohibition had created a kind of shadow government, an economy with its own rules and enforcement, and that ordinary legal institutions were often playing catch-up. 4. From there, Diamond's legacy took two paths at once: a political legacy and a cultural one. Politically, his story became a talking point in the broader argument about what prohibition had produced. People who believed the ban was necessary could point to Diamond as proof of the enemy: lawless men who profited from vice. People who believed the ban had demonstrated its failure could point to Diamond as proof of the policy's unintended consequences. It had turned ordinary drinking into organized crime's most reliable revenue stream. 4. Culturally, Diamond became easier to digest after death. While he was alive, he was a danger and a nuisance, an active force that could ruin a night spot, a business arrangement, a public official's week. After death, he became a story object, a nickname, a sequence of escapes, a final act in Albany. He could be used as color in other people's narratives about the 1920s, Jazz, speakeasies, corruption, the thrill of illegality. This is where a documentary has to be careful. The period is seductive. The slang is catchy. The nightlife imagery is cinematic. But the historical diamond is not a mascot for the good old days. He is part of a system that coerced communities, distorted labor and commerce, and made public institutions less trustworthy. Even when you avoid graphic detail, you can still show the human stakes by emphasizing what his presence did to the people around him. The quiet fear, the pressure on witnesses, the instability for small businesses and workers caught between the law and the men who treated the law like scenery. And Diamond's death didn't erase those stakes, it simply redistributed them. His disappearance opened space in the upstate rackets. It changed who could claim routes and contacts. It changed which names police were told to watch. It changed which local figures could breathe more easily because the most famous irritant was gone. But the underlying economy kept going until the country rewired it. In 1933, the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th, ending national prohibition. 6, that did not end organized crime. It redirected it. The disappearance of alcohol profits forced rackets to diversify and reorganize. Yet repeal did remove the single most lucrative, widely demanded illegal commodity of the era, the one that had allowed so many gangs to scale up fast. Historians of Prohibition treat repeal as a major shift in the relationship between crime, politics, and everyday life, even if it didn't magically restore civic innocence. 4. Diamond didn't live to see repeal. In a way, that is part of what made him so usable as a symbol. He became a figure frozen in the Prohibition frame, a man whose rise and fall fit the era's arc too neatly. The outlaw made by the ban, the celebrity criminal, the repeated courtroom returns, the unresolved ending. But when you look closely, the neatness dissolves. Diamond's life was not a morality play. It was a messy product of incentives, personality, and a national policy that created a black market on an industrial scale. For he was not inevitable, and he was not invincible. He was simply a man who kept choosing the high-risk path until the risk finally collected its debt. In the next segment, we'll step back from the last days and look at what remained after Diamond, how the story was used, how it was embellished, and what his life tells us, without romance, about the machinery of Prohibition-era crime and the public institutions that struggled to contain it. Because the real ending of the Diamond story isn't his death. It's what America did with his name afterward. In the end, Jack Legs Diamond didn't get the kind of ending America claimed to want in the Prohibition years. He didn't become a state's triumph in a tidy courtroom narrative. He didn't stand for sentencing while a judge lectured him about public morals. He didn't disappear into a prison system that could file him away and call the problem solved. Instead, he died the way many Prohibition-era careers ended, abruptly, publicly enough to make news, and without a single official explanation that satisfied everyone. Reference works consistently agree on the core facts. Diamond was shot in Albany in December 1931 and died on December 18, but also reflect the enduring uncertainty and argument over who was responsible. 1, 2, 3. That uncertainty became the first ingredient in his afterlife. Because once Diamond was gone, his name became easier to use. While he was alive, Legs Diamond was a living liability. He drew police scrutiny, underworld retaliation, and press attention that threatened everyone standing near him. After he died, those risks diminished, but the story value increased. A dead gangster can't sue for libel. He can't contradict an embellished account. He can't complicate a neat narrative with inconvenient reality. He becomes a character, and characters are pliable. So the city, both New York and Albany, did what cities often do with trouble after the trouble is over. It edited. It simplified. It recast. In the press and in later retellings, Diamond's life naturally sorted itself into a sequence of dramatic beats: the immigrant-era upbringing, the leap into the liquor economy, the flamboyant nightlife persona, the arrests and acquittals, the repeated attempts on his life that made him notorious as the man who wouldn't stay down, and then the final attack in Albany soon after a major acquittal. 1, 2, 3. Those beats are real enough in outline, but the outline itself became a trap. It encouraged people to read Diamond's life like a script: setup, escalation, climax, finale, rather than like what it was: a chain of choices made inside a system that rewarded the most reckless operators until it didn't. And that system was bigger than Diamond. Prohibition, established through the 18th Amendment and enforced through the Volstead Act, didn't just ban alcohol. It transformed alcohol into the single most broadly demanded illegal commodity in the country. 4-5 The demand remained massive, and the result, described by historians of the period, was a black market economy that fostered corruption and accelerated the growth of organized rackets around supply chains, bribery, and enforcement by intimidation. 6. Diamond's story is, in that sense, less a tale of a uniquely brilliant criminal than a case study in what the era paid for. It paid for boldness. It paid for connections. It paid for men willing to do the jobs that legitimate institutions couldn't acknowledge. And it paid extra for showmanship, because showmanship could make ordinary coercion look like inevitability. Diamond's nickname helped. So did the press culture of the 1920s and early 1930s, which turned certain criminals into public spectacles. The gangster celebrity phenomenon didn't mean the public admired criminality in some pure form. It meant newspapers and, increasingly, other media discovered that crime could be serialized and marketed, especially when the protagonists wore nicknames, moved through glamorous nightlife, and treated courtrooms like stages. Diamond, as later summaries emphasize, was repeatedly arrested and repeatedly returned to the street, an arc that practically wrote itself in headlines. 1, 2, 3. But if the story machine made him famous, it also obscured what his presence did to ordinary people. A documentary can keep YouTube safe and still be honest about harm by focusing on consequences rather than sensational mechanics. Diamond's world imposed costs that didn't appear in his suits or his nightlife. Small businesses and clubs pressured into arrangements they didn't want. Workers and organizers caught in labor rackets that treated livelihoods as leverage. Witnesses who learned that telling the truth had a price. Neighborhoods where the line between police protection and police attention felt negotiable and therefore unreliable. These are not abstract costs. They are the social conflicts embedded in his rise, conflicts that made communities more fearful and institutions less trusted. Historians of Prohibition emphasize that corruption and uneven enforcement weren't occasional glitches. They were recurring features of the era's attempt to police a deeply popular product. 6. Diamond's life also offers a second caution. Not every criminal conflict is gangsters versus the law. Often it's gangsters versus governance. Upstate, especially around Albany, the tension wasn't only about liquor routes. It was about control and embarrassment. A smaller political ecosystem could tolerate certain kinds of vice precisely because it stayed local, quiet, and manageable. A nationally notorious figure disrupted that balance simply by drawing attention. That's why Albany's political context, commonly described through the lens of machine governance, and the long influence associated with Daniel P. O'Connell, matters as background. It helps explain why Diamond's presence upstate could be perceived as destabilizing even to people who were not moral crusaders. 7. This doesn't prove any particular theory about his death. It does something more historically responsible. It shows why theories flourished. When a famous gangster is killed and the case doesn't resolve cleanly, the mind tries to force order onto the mess. People look for a single mastermind, a single motive, a single real story. But the most defensible conclusion, the one consistent with Diamond's documented pattern of conflict, is that he had accumulated so many enemies in so many directions that the suspect list was always going to be broad. 1, 2, 3. In death, Diamond became a mirror. Different audiences looked into him and saw what they already believed. To Prohibition's defenders, he could be framed as proof that society needed moral law, even if enforcement had struggled. To Prohibition's critics, he could be framed as proof that the policy had produced exactly what it promised to prevent: corruption and criminal power built on public demand. 6. To police and prosecutors, he could be framed as a symbol of frustration. How hard it was to build cases when fear and money distorted the legal process. To the press, he could be framed as an endlessly renewable story: the clay pigeon, the public menace, the man who kept returning until he didn't. 1, 2. And then, almost on cue, history shifted beneath everyone's feet. In 1933, the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment, ending national prohibition. 8. Repeal did not erase organized crime, and it didn't retroactively cleanse the corruption the 1920s had normalized. But it did remove the central economic engine that had allowed so many rackets to scale so quickly. Histories of prohibition emphasize that the ban structure created a gigantic illegal market. Repeal changed that structure and forced criminal enterprises to adapt. 6. Diamond never had to adapt. That paradoxically helped preserve his legend. He remains tied to a specific mood in American memory: the speakeasy era, the bootleg roots, the courthouse dramas, the sensation that law and lawlessness were playing chess on the same board. Because his story ends before repeal, it can be packaged as a complete prohibition fable: rise, chaos, and a fall that arrives before the policy itself collapses. But if you resist the urge to romanticize the period, a different meaning emerges. Diamond's life shows how a society can create a profitable contradiction, ban what millions still want, then act shocked when intermediaries appear to satisfy demand outside the law. It shows how corruption can become not just an individual failing but a practical tool, an adaptation to an impossible enforcement task. And it shows how celebrity can distort accountability. A man becomes famous for surviving consequences, and that fame itself becomes part of why the consequences escalate. If you return to the opening image, the quiet street, the shuttered storefront, the city holding its breath, the tension wasn't just the threat of crime. It was the sense that the official story and the lived story were diverging. In that divergence, Diamond found a career. And in that divergence, he found his end. Because a man can survive rivals, and he can survive police attention, and he can even survive a few lucky breaks in court. But surviving a whole era's contradictions, an era that made him possible, profitable, and intolerable, was something else entirely. So what survived Jack Legs Diamond? Not an empire, not a stable organization with a clear successor. What survived was a lesson in incentives and attention, sealed inside a name that still turns up whenever prohibition is discussed. A reminder that when a society tries to legislate desire out of existence, it often ends up legislating opportunity into someone else's hands. And once opportunity is armed with notoriety, it rarely stays contained. And as the night settles once more over the silent empires, we step away from the dangerous, restless world of Legs Diamond, a man who walked the edge between life and death and somehow kept moving forward. His story fades softly into the darkness, echoing with close calls, narrow escapes, and a legend built on survival itself. If this journey helped you relax or drift toward sleep, remember to like the video, subscribe, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support keeps these quiet stories alive. Now let your breathing slow, let the silence surround you, and allow the echoes of history to guide you gently into the night. Good night.